Croeso, Difda, Bernachtin, Gia Hwitch, Fulcher, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. I am your humble host, Sian Esther Powell, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. That's Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Isle of Man, Scotland and Ireland. Welcome. Welcome. I honestly need to start doing bloopers for this podcast, guys. The amount of times that I have tried to record the first few minutes. I'm in one of those strange moods where I don't have motivation. I'm not in the right headspace, but I'm going to persevere and force my way through it because I told you all I had the loose goal of uploading every 2 weeks. I wanted to do 24 episodes in 2024, and I just refuse to be felled in the first month. I refuse to be defeated by myself. So we're going to do it because this actually is going to be a super interesting topic and it is exciting. Your girl's just in a funky headspace, but we're going to move through it because I'm introducing a new Celtic nation to the mix. That's right, I've mentioned it before to some of you, and I've also talked about it on social media and on my Patreon, but I am now introducing Galicia and Asturias to the mix. So this is our very first Galician episode. Very, very excited to welcome a new Celtic nation into the mix, and hopefully we'll have some people from that region listening to this podcast. If you are already, hello, welcome. Very excited to have you here. And if they're not, well, welcome for the future. Like 2 hours has passed since that bit, and I watched 10 Things I Hate About You in that time period. My brain is just it's not working today, my friends. It's not in gear. It's here, it's there, it's up and down, it's spinning in circles, but we're gonna try. Because we have oh good grief, I'm in full goblin mode today, so I swear to God. Enchanted Mouras. Just got to get it out there and say it. Enchanted Mouras, that's what we're talking about today. The Enchanted Mouras of Galician and Northern Portuguese folklore. There we go. I've said it. I can't back down now. One day, a young farmer had finished his tasks early and he decided to take himself on a woodland stroll. There was a kind of magic to that day. The sunlight cast strange patterns on his skin as it travelled its way through the leaves and trees of the forest. Here and there he might spy a squirrel or a bird perched high above, and once or twice he thought he spied a wolf. And yet he was not scared, and so he continued to walk, his body propelling him forward as if by enchantment. And although he had been walking for hours at this point, he was not dismayed, for this was a long summer day. The longest day of the year, in fact. A day that held such possibilities. Lost in his thoughts, the young farmer did not realize when the birds stopped singing. He did not realize when the faces of squirrels, mice, birds, and even wolves began to disappear. He did not realize when the temperature began to change, a cold chill blowing through the trees. These are the signs that you must look out for when you go for long walks in the woods. These are ways not to be pisky-led, not to be captured by the fairies. But this was a mortal man. His mind did not yet preoccupy itself with beautiful fairy maidens. Instead, there was a young woman in his village who he had begun to set his eyes on. Thinking of the girl with the black hair and red cheeks, he started to pick wildflowers. Until he had enough for a bouquet, he bent down to the forest floor, and only when he stood back up with the last flower did he realize that something was not quite right. He looked down at his arm and saw goosebumps on his flesh, and he realized that the cold had begun to set in. This was the summer solstice. in the middle of the day? Why was his body reacting this way? He looked around himself for tiny forest eyes and saw none, nor did he hear the forest animals. The only thing he could hear was a young woman's voice, sad and plaintive, carried by the wind. He had never heard anything like it, and so he followed the voice into the very heart of the forest. Deeper and deeper he went, until the trees opened out into a clearing, and there, sat on a rock near a dolmen, was a beautiful young maiden singing and brushing her long red hair with a glistening golden comb. He paused at the edge of the clearing, just behind the trees, and watched her for a while. Although graceful and fluid in her motions, he had the sense of her being a prisoner somehow, and as he looked closer, he saw tears on her beautiful face. And there were no birds that perched near her, no forest creatures to keep her company, and he felt in his breast a deep sadness and empathy for the young woman, who could sing so very beautifully and yet be so very alone. She did not appear to notice him at first, and so he began to walk into the clearing. He could not stop himself, as if he was bewitched by her singing and her countenance. Was it that deep sadness that brought his footsteps closer? And as he walked around the dolmen, those ancient tombs beloved by such people as the young maiden he saw before him, his feet finally came to a stop, and it was as though a bolt of recognition surged through his body, and it was finally too late to leave. He had made his choice this day, and his choice had led him face to face with the Enchanted Moura. And finally she stopped singing. "Hello, young man," she said. "Hello," replied the young man. "Why are you here alone and singing so?" he asked. "I sing this sad and plaintive song because, sir, I am cursed." "Cursed? Who cursed you, madam?" "I do not know his name. All I know is that he was one of the Moros, those beings that live in the world below. He cursed me to look after his treasure, or he ventured to Morama, the other world. And so I have been here since." And as she said this, she gestured to the stone beside her, and the young farmer saw gold and silver and jewels, and a great many other precious things. What need have he of gold and jewels and silver if he travels to such a land? I do not pretend to know the inner workings of the mind of the Moros Encantados, but perhaps, she said, leaning in closer to the young farmer, there is such a one that might make better use of these things. Mayhaps he has a lady love, or a greed for riches. And if such a one could free me from this curse, then these riches would be his. The young farmer thought for a moment. All of these deals came with a price. He knew that much about the stories. And wouldn't his family and friends and village folk question him if he suddenly had silver and gold and jewels? But the Moura looked at him with eyes glistening with unshed tears, and he saw a path down her cheeks where previous tears had dried, and he remembered her beautiful singing that seemed a lifetime ago, even though it was probably but a moment. "What are the conditions of the curse, lady?" he said, "for I wish to break it." "Ah," she said, "it would only take a kiss." So, who are the Enchanted Mouras? They nature guardians, elves, evil sirens luring poor men to their untimely deaths. Seems they might come in all shapes and sizes. Ha ha ha! See what I did there? No, you don't, because I haven't got to that point yet. They're also shapeshifters in a lot of the stories, and it's said that sort of every town and village had its own version of the Enchanted Moura and its own story. So the one that I've just gone through is my own. I just sort of made it up, but inspired by other stories that I've read and come across of the Enchanted Moura. And the stories seem to follow that same kind of pattern. It's usually a young man that is taken in by the Moura's singing or her beauty as she's combing either sort of golden hair or black raven wing hair. But in the Galician stories, she is usually a redhead. There seems to have existed some stories where the Enchanted Moura appeared to be an older woman, but it does seem that in the vast majority of stories, she's a young and beautiful woman, and she is under a curse. So she is under a spell that needs to be broken. And it is usually the sort of the male version, the Moros. They are the ones that have put a curse on her, usually to guard their treasure, as they then go to Morama, which is sort of the Galician version of the other world found in Irish and Welsh mythology, for example. And I love this because some of my favourite stories are found in the Mabinogi, those Welsh medieval mythic tales preoccupied with great heroes and seemingly almost demigod type characters. And I also love a lot of the medieval Irish myths and legends, and going back to the other world, venturing into the other world. So I love the idea of there being other worlds in other cultures. So it was really cool to discover Morama, which is often described as land of the dead, but can be described as that sort of world, a chthonic world, kind of, or a world overlapping our own. And that's exactly how I view the other world in Welsh and Irish mythology as well. And much like Cornish and Breton mythology, dolmens in Galician and northern Portuguese mythology are very, very significant. It is the dolmens, and often they themselves were named for the Enchanted Mouras or the Moros, those kind of elf, pisky, fairy-like creatures found in Galician and Portuguese mythology. And it's these dolmens which are said to be kind of portals to the other world. And that is very similar to what you find in Cornish and Breton mythology as well. You'll remember that a couple episodes ago we talked about the Corrigans of Breton mythology. So in some ways, the Enchanted Moura is very similar to one version of the Corrigan in Breton mythology, which is, you know, very beautiful woman combing her hair. In a lot of the stories, these beings were said to be the ones that built the dolmens and built some of these kind of Paleolithic and Neolithic stone structures and passage tombs. And of course, you could draw the parallel with the mounds and tumuli that have the same significance in Irish culture and mythology as portals to the other world. So the Enchanted Moura is usually under a spell, under a curse, and there is a condition on which the curse can be broken. Now, in a lot of the stories, the condition is a kiss, but it can actually vary quite significantly. In some stories, it's simply pronouncing a word in a certain way, or it can be a specific trinket, and any other number of quite diverse things. But there is a way to break the curse, and usually when that happens, the Moura herself can turn into a mortal woman, or in a lot of the stories, she turns into a snake or another animal. There doesn't seem to be that much of a sinister or fatal element to these stories. They don't seem to end in death, for example. So it's not like the Enchanted Moura is like, free me from my curse, and then I'm just going to kill you afterwards. It usually happens that if she turns into a mortal woman, then she can marry the man. Or if she turns into a snake, she usually just slithers into a bush and just minds her own business. But often you see in the stories is that even if these young men break the curse, when they go home and try and tell their family members, they'll kind of open up their pockets to show them these jewels and gold and silver, and usually everything is just turned to rocks, which I have come across that kind of concept and sentiment in other stories before as well, usually with a more sinister aspect to it, because it usually involves someone stealing something from the fair folk and then realising that it's stones. But no, this seemed to be a kind of trickery, but a payment for breaking the curse. It's just the payment is usually, like I said, a trick. There's a real kind of magical fairy tale like quality about this concept and these stories that I really, really, really enjoyed. And I think that I'm gonna absolutely love doing these Galician episodes, because it's just learning about a new area of the world to me, and finding all these similarities with Cornwall, with Wales, with Ireland, with Brittany, with Isle of Man, and also some wonderful differences as well. So for example, I had to look up what animals live in Galicia and Portugal, and it was like Iberian wolf, and I realised, oh well, of course we don't have wolves in the UK or some of the other Celtic nations, but there's wolves in this region, which is just amazing. So there we go, let's put a wolf in the story. So José Leite Vasconcelos was a Portuguese ethnographer, and did in fact become the founder and the first director of the Portuguese National Museum of Archaeology. And according to him, the Mouras Encantadas, the Enchanted Mouras, are beings compelled by an occult power to live on a certain state of siege as if they were numb or asleep, insofar as a particular circumstance does not break their spell. And he also considered it a possibility that the Mouras themselves could have been assimilating the characteristics of previous pre-Christian local deities, or beings such as nature spirits and nymphs of the forest. And these tales are part of the kind of wider lore of the Mouros Encantados, much like the Tuatha Danann of Irish mythology and those beings found in the Mabinogi of Welsh mythology. These are kind of creatures of the other world, so fairies and giants and mythic heroes. Kind of, they all seem to come under that umbrella term of the Mouros Encantados as well. The wonderful thing about these folk tales, and which is a characteristic of a lot of my favourite folk tales actually, is that they are so kind of embedded into the landscape and the local archaeology of a place. So there are so many archaeological elements that have been used to bolster the stories of the Enchanted Mouras, whether it's where they knead bread, where they spin yarn. There's all these stories of them doing different things, and it's dependent on the archaeology and the archaeological features and the granite and everything else of a place to what the Moura would have been doing there. For example, the rock-cut tombs called Mazeira, these are the places where the Mouras knead bread. And there's a dolmen de Casa de Moura, the Moura's house dolmen. Because in some stories, she actually lives inside the stone. That is part of her curse and her entrapment. There has been a lot of scholarly kind of analysis on these stories and what they could mean and how they can help us understand the archaeology of a place and the people that came before. So some of the stories include the treasure found in kind of funerary urns, which kind of implies that there's some sort of funerary element to this. Of course, the importance of the dolmens themselves being, tombs. Your phone isn't ringing. That was the phone in my background, but I'm leaving it anyway. Obviously tombs, but also portals to Mourama or the other world as well. And usually, as I said, the curse is placed upon her by a male Mouros. So this, in some of the stories, could be her father, could be a brother, so it could be a male relative, or it could just be a random Mouros that's tasking her with guarding his treasure. They kind of exist to be at the whim of a man, which is not so great, I must admit, but I think it's kind of interesting territory for there to be modern revamped versions of the myth. So I would love to see some kind of modern versions of the story that are playing on old stereotypes and expectations, but then actually turning it all around. But ultimately, they're really cool stories, and they kind of hint at a larger, wider world of magic and enchantment that's kind of embedded into the very landscape of Galicia itself. And I think that's so wonderful and exciting. And a big reason why I love folklore so much is that I feel like it can help to re-enchant the landscape around you. It can give you another pair of eyes in a way. It can help you look at the land around you in a different way and to see magic and to see enchantment. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode. It was really great for me to be able to delve into a kind of new folk tale, very new to me, in a new region, and I'm really excited that we're covering Galicia now. And next episode, I think we're on to Asturias, so that should be very interesting as well. The more I delve into these regions, the more I find all this amazing like traditional song and dance and customs. So yes, I'm looking forward to keeping this podcast going for as long as I can, getting 24 episodes out this year, and just sharing a lot of these cool stories, myths, legends and customs from the Celtic nations. I do want to say a big, massive thank you to all the new patrons on Patreon in the last 2 weeks. So that's Christian, Gabby, Janet, Angie and David. Thank you ever so much. I really do appreciate it. I'm planning on doing a kind of video call kind of catch up, maybe like on Zoom or Teams, something like that, doing a catch up with my patrons on Patreon at the end of the month, perhaps on the 27th or the 28th of this month. And I think that's going to be really, really fun, because I've got this storytelling game, I bought it, called The Hollow Woods. Now, I don't know how I'm going to make it work, but I feel like, so I've got a bunch of beautiful storytelling cards, and I think it's supposed to obviously be played in person, and then each new card gives you like a different scenario, so you're sort of building your own folktale, but I'm going to try and work it so that we can do it in a kind of video call medium, and I think that it could be really fun. So I think Patreon is now brought in free memberships, so if you want to, please find me on Patreon. You don't need to pay, you don't need to be part of any of the paid tiers, because they've also now introduced free memberships. But I will start doing kind of little catch-ups with people at the end of each month, and I'm also going to be doing bonus Patreon little mini episodes for the paid Patreon members. So like I said, this main podcast will always be free, I've always said that, but I will do little topics here and there that don't quite fit into the podcast, or something that I want to cover but is not scheduled to be in the podcast for like a year or so, that I just want to talk about. So I'll be doing a little bonus episode on the Cornish pub shouts very soon, as I mentioned in the last episode. So I'll be putting that on my Patreon. And as I said, at the end of the month, we'll be doing a kind of video call catch up where I try and get this storytelling card game working in that medium. So thank you so much once again to Christian, Gabby, Janet, Angie and David for joining Patreon as paid members. Thank you very much. And for the rest of you, lovely chatting to you as always, and I look forward to chatting to you again in a couple weeks' time. Bye! I am your host, Sian Esther Powell, and that has been another episode of the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. If you would like to find it elsewhere on the interwebs, you can also find me on Twitter at Celtic Myths Pod, on Facebook under Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast, on Patreon at Celtic Myths Pod, as well as Instagram at Celtic_Sian, and also CelticSian.co.uk. Thank you, Mouras, Diolch, Tachpalet, Guramahagat, Trigare, Guramayed. Thank you, and speak to you next time. Thank you.